welcome to another episode of Words with Friends. In this episode, I'm delighted to introduce to you somebody that I've got to know very, very well over the last couple of years, and I'm certain that you are going to be blown away, not just by the sheer amount of intellect and skill that she has in her craft, but the way she shows up as a human. I think you're going to fall in love with her real quick through this episode. So I'd like to invite you to be able to get to know a little better my dear friend, Miss Kate O'Neill. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Phil. What a wonderful, gracious, generous introduction, but I would expect no less from you. You're a wonderful human yourself.
Oh, bless you. Bless you. Well, thank you so much. And for those of you that don't know Kate and Kate's work, Kate spends the bulk of her time helping organizations to be able to bridge that gap between the digital world and the human world and how those intersect together. And some of her most famous pieces of work are books like Text Humanist and Pixels in Place. And she is often referred, or requested by some of the world's biggest brands to help them navigate the decisions that are all around this gracious area of where technology intersects with people and how those decisions are made on from there. So Kate, I'm delighted that you're here. What did I miss out of your bio that is important for people to know about you?
Oh man, that bio was fantastic. I'm just going to ask you to come with me into all of my events from now on and just read that way. I think the only other perspective is that I really think of my work as being in this realm that is often dystopian, and a lot of the work that is necessary is looking at the future in this very cautionary way. And I feel like my job is to be a more hopeful voice and to shine a light on what's possible still if we do the work that's necessary to get us
Okay.
there.
Well, one thing I know about you is you always bring hope, you always bring joy, you always bring possibility. One thing that I'm guessing that a handful of our listeners might not jump towards the complete conclusion on, though, is what does dystopian mean?
Oh, well, it's a fair clarification. I think if folks have encountered a lot of sci-fi and fantasy in the form of either books or movies, you've probably seen the sort of the view of the future where everything is gray and dark and dusty and sooty, and everything is controlled by machines, and there's very sort of sublimation of anything that's natural or human, and that kind of play out of the way that things could go is the way I think a lot of the projections of futurists tend to lean. It's like, let's be
So that
careful we don't
Matrix
create that.
style
Yeah,
look of kind of behind the scenes there and very
right.
dusty, not much lighting the sky because the sky is covered up in some way.
Blade
Okay.
Runner meets the Matrix. Yeah,
Got it.
exactly.
Got it. Well, thanks for clarification on there. And it's a funny link in, actually, because we're here to talk about words. Dystopian is not the word that we're going to talk about today, although that we have
Good.
already spoken about that word. You're probably wondering what your word is for this very special episode. And word for you that we're going to jam into today is humanity.
Oh,
It's
wonderful.
a pretty big word. Why do you think I might have picked that word for you?
Oh, well, I mean, there's the obvious, which is that it's in the title of my most recent book, in some form, Tech
Yeah.
Humanist, right? So in its own nature, I think the work that I do kind of begs this question of what is the relationship of technology and humanity, and how do we reconcile those together? But I think there's a bigger exploration that I do, and that it's gracious of you to acknowledge, I think, with this word, that I'm trying to always look for what the themes of what makes us human really are, so that we can build those out through technology, and we can bring those to business too. We can do everything possible to make sure that the contexts that we live in are as redemptive of our humanity as possible, and give us as much opportunity to fully explore what it means to be human in all the best ways, and to give us the best possible futures for ourselves as humans. So that's a
Keep going
wonderful
on
word.
that for me. Keep
Okay.
going on that for me. What I want you to be able to do is almost to define what humanity means to you. What does it show up in your world as your lens?
So there's this, I guess you could almost look at the difference between human on one sort of lens and humanity on another lens. Like there's the micro and the macro. And I think when you look at humanity, it's this kind of collective understanding of what it means to be human, but it embodies all of the human experience and the human condition, and all of the things that literature and art have asked us over centuries and millennia. What does it mean to be human? And so I think that's what humanity contains within it, is this great pondering of why are we any different from other animals? Why are we different from non-animals, machines, and so on? And why are we now thinking of ourselves as different from those machines that we're creating to do work with us and for us, and in some cases instead of us? And so what does it mean to be human is embedded within this concept of humanity, I think. So
Okay.
humanity includes that question of meaning and the relevance and context of all of that we contain within all of what we contain within ourselves.
So there's a lot in this, and
Of
we're going to
course.
keep going further. Is you've done a ton of research on this, you've explored how this shows up in a lot of different environments, and no doubt probably done more thinking around this than the average person.
Yeah.
So what conclusions have you come to about that question of what does it mean to be human?
So I've asked a lot of people, in addition to having thought about it a lot myself. And I always find it very interesting to ask people what they think the most human characteristics are. And inevitably, I think there's kind of groupings of answers. So one group of answers is that we are creative and we're problem solving and we tend to be innovative, and like we use tools, and so we're that's what makes us humans, is that we're creative and we can get our way out of sticky situations. But I always kind of push back on that set of answers because I feel like we know that animals can also use tools
Yeah.
and can be creative, right? So that's not necessarily uniquely human. But then there's another set of answers that comes out, which is an endearing set of answers, that people tend to think of humans as having love and empathy and compassion, and that really seems to be a very popular answer. Until I push back on that a little bit and say, well, I mean, I think we know that there are animals that are capable of exhibiting at least what we can recognize as
You bet.
something like love, right?
Yeah.
And like we've seen dogs and elephants and monkeys and all sorts of animals
I've seen
perform
people
what look
have more
like
intimate relationships with their pets than they have with people, right? So yeah.
absolutely, yeah, and animals amongst themselves performing acts of like self-sacrifice and things like that.
Hmm.
So if we ask that question, what's the difference between empathy or love and what looks like empathy or love, then I think we're getting at something that's a little more core to the human experience, which is this kind of this pondering, this wondering of like, what does it mean to be empathetic and to love? That level of thought and reflection and self-analysis and understanding of the world and context and putting things together and having an existential view of all of those questions is what I think the human experience really is. And I boil that down to meaning. I talk in my work a lot about meaning. So
Hmm.
meaning is the sort of central theme of my work, and in all of its different incarnations. From the semantic level, I was a linguist by education,
Yeah.
so I go there sort of for free. Uh, and then all the way out, all the way out through these different kind of like patterns and relevance and significance and purpose, all the way out to like cosmic and existential meaning, like why are we here and what's it all about, right? All those different kinds of things are all part of this framework of meaning, but they're all part of what we do when we're trying to figure out the answer to the question, what makes us human? So I feel like it's just this really interesting meta
Yeah,
analysis,
that we're
right?
probably never going to get to an answer on, right? It's not going to find itself in a box. And maybe there's even something in that, is this constant need to be able to challenge status quo, this need to find order amongst chaos, yet this continued creation of chaos whilst trying to find order within chaos is certainly something that I see people do a great deal of. Now, Kate, in the
Yeah.
current times that we're in, I've even found myself saying this, like we've got to put people before profits. And those words have left my mouth and left my keyboard a few times. And I've thought about it after I've written it. And then I hear other people saying we've got to make the decision that's right for humanity. And here we are in a set of circumstances that I don't know what that decision is.
Yeah.
What is the
Well, it's
decision that is right for humanity as a whole right now? So jam on that with me for a second. Is what is the thinking that goes around the decision making that people are being asked to make right now, and whether this is public decision making, whether this is leaders in organization decision making. What are some of the things that you would be looking at to be able to help people navigate decisions as to what's right for humanity right
That's such a great big question. I love it. I would say it comes back to what I mentioned earlier about those two lenses, the micro and the macro, right?
now?
The humanity lens, like we're talking about with this word, is the at scale lens, right? Like if you can deal with solutions at scale, if you are someone who's serving sort of on the front lines of the World Health Organization or the CDC or whatever, whatever kind of organization that's looking across the globe or across countries and
Yeah,
looking at humanity at large and trying to solve at that scale, then by all means you have to think about these very interconnected systems of solutions, right? But I think there's also a way in which, for the majority of us, we need to bring that thinking way down to this very individual level of human experience, one-on-one, personal type of transactional type of interactions, where we figure out how we can just help the person who's in front of us. What can we do with the person we're talking to right now and help them in some small way, even to get through the moment that they're in or the problem that they're trying to solve. And I think what happens then is if we do that a few times, if we do that enough, person to person, moment to moment, human to human, that we begin to start to see the patterns of what emerges in a moment like this, in the chaos of a pandemic, as well as kind of in quote unquote normal circumstances. It's funny, I was just on the phone with Jess Pettit, and I know she did the word
yeah.
normal with you. So it's fun to sort of bring that back
Just
in
bring that back. Yeah,
a whole different context of normal.
right.
um, what's normal under non-pandemic circumstances. I think we still gain a lot of wisdom and insight by thinking at that human to human level and then figuring out how to scale that up if we can to
Yeah.
solve for humanity by understanding what people need at individual levels.
And I guess there's always been uncertainty in the world, and there's always been chaos going on, and there's always been some version of a pandemic happening in people's lives, right? Regardless of where it might be. I think this is just a period of time where what we have is the whole world experiencing a set of circumstances and
Yeah.
emotions almost at exactly the same time, maybe with some overlapping different patterns of where they sit on that. Um, but the point you just made about dealing with what's right in front of you, dealing with the human that's right in front of you, I want to go deeper on that for a second and see, is there any examples that you've witnessed recently where people have done this in the real world and you've actually seen this play out well and seen this go some distance?
Yeah, I think the one of our friends, our mutual friends, Jeffrey Shaw,
Hmm.
does a beautiful job of translating his work as a photographer and visual branding expert over years into helping people think about their own personal brands. And one of the things he's realized in the context of this, he also does a podcast called Creative Warriors. And
Yeah.
one of the things he's realized in the course of this pandemic is that what he's really uniquely suited to do right now is help individual sort of solopreneurs and creative professionals understand how to navigate the uncertainty of the moment, because he's been that, and he's only been that. He's never had a job, as he puts
Right.
it. He's only ever been an independently employed, creative professional,
Yeah.
and
So
he's been
uncertainty has
through.
been his life forever, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
actually that's his happy place. That's a great point.
yeah. And so he's doing this like one-on-one kind of coaching and consulting with people. And I would be very surprised if that doesn't turn into a thriving business at scale for him, even more than it already is over time, as he builds that into more of a model and people, regain some stable footing over the coming months and years.
Okay.
So I think that's one example I've seen where I've been really encouraged to see, someone taking that very careful, slow, human to human connection and really getting down to that level.
Okay. As this physical distancing thing starts to become the more accepted norm for whatever period of time that may run for, is clearly lots of businesses are looking to be able to change the way they communicate with their customers. They're looking to be able to rush en masse towards tools and technology to be able to help bridge the gap between what their old normal looked like and what their current reality looks like. What are some of the warning signs that people might need to be aware of? What are some of the things that they could trip up on here, where for their desire to be able to either serve their employees or serve their customers by using technology, they could end up sabotaging that potential relationship through not thinking the way that Kate O'Neill would think?
Well, I think the way that I think about experiences that take place, whether they're online or offline, is that they inhabit a context, right? Like there's a context that experiences and interactions take place in. And we cannot ignore the fact that right now the larger context of that is a pandemic,
Right.
and most people sheltering at home, and having a great deal of uncertainty about their income, and so on and so on and so on. I'm sure even by the time people are listening to this, it will have already changed. Even if you release this tomorrow,
Right.
there's
We
so
can
much.
release this now. I mean, we saw that happen with the British Prime Minister sending out a letter that to
Right.
communicate what was going on. That by the time the letter was received, almost everything had changed again in a 48-hour window. And you're right. Like this is
Right.
going to be continually changing.
So
So
there's
what are they doing?
context,
Okay.
right? So context, and within that too, I think when you're trying to figure out the new normal for the way your business operates, a lot of it is moved to these kind of Zoom calls and
Yep.
webinar type of presentations and virtual meetings. And I think a lot of what the natural tendency for people crushing all of the physical world of work into a virtual interaction is to want to take everything that's possible in physical space and represent it somehow in a virtual or digital realm. And there may be analogs that exist into many of those kinds of facets of experience, but they probably aren't very satisfying, and they may be very draining in light
What
of
do you
the.
mean? What do you mean? Give me an example of that, just of where we might
So
be trying to replicate things in a digital world that don't necessarily translate that well.
I think a lot of people are working in companies where there are sort of stand-up meetings. You do these daily huddles and things like that, right? And so you maybe, I know in one company I used to work in, we would gather in the CEO's office every day, and we would literally huddle around his desk, and we would all do our status updates. And uh, one thing is time has changed so significantly. And so doing these once a day where everybody goes round robin like that is probably a very different set of temporal realities than it ever was when
Yeah.
you were doing this, in an office where things were just functioning the way they normally would. But also that kind of sharing over these virtual Zoom calls and the vulnerability that it takes to say, like, well, I'm not meeting my deadlines, and there's a lot of stresses, my dog's barking, the baby needs changing, my wife is stressing, whatever the situation is, you're bringing in a lot of very different kind of realities into those discussions uh, that they don't necessarily translate very well, and we don't have the skills yet, I think, as moderators and participants in those types of meetings and interactions, to know how to sort of modulate that and know how to be professional and present at the same time, and be as truthful about what's really happening
That's such a
as
good
we can
point.
be.
And there's a very different level of responsibility of being a participant in those kind of meetings, right? Is if you're in that meeting in person,
Mhm.
sat around the desk, etc., like you are in that meeting in person, sat around the desk. You can't really be somewhere else. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
there is a trained behavior that has existed in a lot of people that if they are watching something on a screen, then they can do other things at that same time and they can show up with a different level of participation, and therefore their
Yeah.
headspace is different too, right? So there's so much in that. So context is one thing that people need to be thinking about. What else?
Context, and what I guess part of what we're talking about in the discussion of of that example and other types of examples, like if you were thinking about physical conferences, conferences that you would actually go to and attend a keynote session or go to a breakout session, where we know what a conference flows like and feels like, and all that from the many of us have attended or spoken at.
Yeah.
uh, but there's an effort, I think there's this try to uh, there's this sense of trying to replicate that with Zoom and other platforms, that it ends up crushing the metaphors that in weird ways, like the things that are actually native to these platforms, like the ability to do, as you say, like have this kind of multitasking presence is there's a benefit to that if we can
Hmm.
actually play that up. If we can play to the strength of, I can be here in this call with you and sort of typing my notes on my laptop, and oh, I had to check that one email and all that, and it doesn't really seem that I've ever left the session. It doesn't ever really seem that I'm ever that distant. So there's a way that we can use that to our advantage, but we haven't really begun to start from,
So that's
we
like
haven't started from the
permissions
starting
and
point.
rules as well, right? That's like creating new rules of engagement around this so people understand how to behave, because there isn't this inherent rule book that we've learned through experience. There is new rules that need to be set for people to understand the boundaries.
It's culture too, and I think that goes back to this, this bigger picture of humanity has within it the understanding of culture, right? And like we have understandings of what norms and rules and behaviors are within any given context. And so to be able to understand what is the culture that now takes place in this virtual space, that's just
Hmm.
inevitably going to be different from the culture that takes place in a physical space. We have to know that. We have to be ready for that. And we have to be kind of open-minded to the idea of reinventing it ever so
Okay.
slightly and figuring it out for these environments.
What about the hundreds and thousands right now of maybe independently owned businesses that were very much um, business to consumer, service focused, whether it was the hairdressers, the local laundry service, the tax accountants, the pizza delivery place? What about these businesses right now that are reading articles everywhere that says you need to move your business online, you need to pivot, you need to be able to change and embrace technology to be able to continue to survive in this market? What advice do you bring to those kind of situations?
Well, I think we're looking at the wisdom and the advice that has been given for 2 decades about moving your business online suddenly being crushed into, a couple of weeks window, right?
Yep.
Everyone who's ever run a business in the real world has been told that advice, I'm sure. Like the laundry
Yeah, it's
people, the
not new
hairdressers,
news,
all the
right?
people you just listed off, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not like they never heard before that they should do business online. But now all of a sudden that's the only way that they could do anything in this context. And that really changes the pressure. It really changes the stakes. And I think it's natural that our sort of monkey brains start freezing and panicking a little in that moment. So I think we have to give ourselves permission to not have the answers right away. And
Hmm.
it's not going to be an easy pivot for a lot of those businesses. There are plenty of opportunities to get creative and be innovative with how a small independent business can adapt to online. And I've seen some really interesting collective businesses kind of getting together and figuring out. I live in Manhattan, and so in my neighborhood of Hell's Kitchen, there's been a sense of the restaurants in the neighborhood trying to figure out how to share resources and how to be, sort of assisting each other in being able
That's awesome.
to yeah, to stopgap a little bit of the bleeding that's happening with their businesses, with people not being able to go to the restaurants and only being able to do delivery or takeout. And most people are not doing that because we're just too nervous about the spread of the virus. But that banding together and sharing resources and figuring out what's the collective that we can get here, I think that brings us back again to that humanity level where we're taking and making the most of what it means to be together as a species, as a group, as a whole, where we say, it's one thing to be a human in these times, and we're scared and we're trying to figure out,
Yeah.
how we're going to navigate it individually, but we also belong to this larger group, and that is, many larger groups, really, no matter what level of Zoom you take out. But that level of humanity of saying we're all going through this right now, and
Yeah.
forever we're going to be changed by this. So a reckoning with that is necessary and important, I think, to get ourselves to where we need to be.
There's a brand that I wanted to touch on a little with you that have done interesting things through the years, often used as a case study in conferences, and it's Domino's, the pizza chain. And I find it fascinating to see, how they're celebrated as a tech company that largely delivers pizza, right? But they're a
Yeah.
tech company first, etc. But as I've been thinking about this human element to it, and this came very much front of mind the other day when we decided to order from Domino's. is, the face they have on a robotized um, interface as the platform that they have, and the language patterns that then come out of that robot piece that is very much, I think, hitting that show me that you know me piece.
Hmm.
It's very much communicating in a way that you would look for a friend to communicate with you in these times. There is some humor added to it. There is some humility added to it. There is just a general understanding that we all know what's going on here, right? You're ordering something that you probably shouldn't be ordering according to your dietitian. Your needs and requirements as to why you're having this could be, one of a number of reasons, but also
Right.
one not one, not a lot of others on those. And I'm wondering how much thought they put into the persona of that ordering system and the human side of how they choose to be able to communicate with something that everybody knows is a computer, yet still is showing up to communicate to us like a person.
Yeah, so there's a whole sort of ethical dilemma that's represented in that, right? And I wrote a piece some time ago, which is part of Tech Humanist now, called "Should a Bot Have to Tell You It's a Bot?" And it explores this whole idea that, because I think we see this a lot with banks too. So you
Yeah,
get a lot of the push toward digital transformation is happening front and center with the customer support features first, where it's like maybe we can
yeah,
offset some of what's going into the call center by having some of the easy answers taken by bots, right? But then you do get into these questions of how much personality are we encoding in this? How much are we going to try to make it feel like you're having an interaction with a real person, with a
right.
human? And I think there starts to be some question of, you get into the uncanny valley space for sure, where it's like, oh, I don't know which I'm really dealing with, and there should be a clear sense for people. So what we came back with, all the research that I did at that time led me to the belief that most people don't really care whether they're dealing with a human or a bot. They would like to know the difference at some level. They don't want it to be played off as if it's one or the other when it's the other.
Right.
And if it's going to be in a lot of cases with, like, so the bank transactions, for example, there will probably be a handoff at some point from a very simple kind of transaction to anything that gets to be more complex. It's going to go from that bot to a human operator, and that handoff should be seamless. And that's the only thing that the person on the other side of the transaction cares about, is don't forget all the information I already told you. Don't
Yeah.
lose our place in this conversation. But I think the not faking it, and the choice of what persona, what characteristics, that's all incredibly important reflections of who we think we are as people and what we think we are as a society too. There's a great research piece that was done in a few years ago called "I'd Blush If I Could," which was looking at the nature of a lot of the primary predominant virtual assistants to be female voices by default. So Siri and Alexa and so
Wow.
on,
Yeah.
right? And the way that people talk to these assistants is studied in this piece, and a lot of it tends to be understood that you're going to be not asking please and not saying thank you, because that would be weird if in some ways. But then kids do sometimes when they're interacting with assistants, and that becomes a really interesting reflection on who we are as humans and what our relationship with machines should be. So there's a
This
lot
is
to
pretty
unpack
deep, right? We
there.
can go a long way on all of this. And I think, if I'm to try and take a simplified takeaway from that, is if you are looking to be able to use technology to replace a human interaction that used to happen within your organization, how can it be honest? How can it be true?
Right.
And also, how can it potentially provide a service that is better for the human
Yeah,
than the alternative?
better, and that leads into something that is entrusted, right? Like if I am uh interacting with you now, and this is something that a conversation I was having the other day with on a interview, that there's a great opportunity for businesses right now in light of this to do as much service as they possibly can and to
Hmm.
go out of their way to make sure they're bending over backwards. Airlines that are insisting on vouchers for credits only are going to be remembered after this in a not very favorable way. And those that are going out of their way to make sure that they're sending out reassuring messages and preserving status and doing all of the things that they possibly can are going to be remembered going forward as favorable brands. And that distinction is going to be felt and is going to be remembered. So that will translate into trust and that will translate into loyalty. And those things are incredibly important to the human proxy of the relationships that brands have with their customers.
And I guess this can translate to every level, even in small business too, right? Is if you have customers on a trial period that was a 30-day trial period, and that's happened during this period of time, proactive communication to say, let's extend that trial period
Yes.
to a point where it is 30 days past whatever this new
Yeah.
date is that we don't know, and doing that all on the front foot
Yeah,
is
and
huge.
even my gym sent a message early on that was saying, we know you can't come to the gym. Don't worry about calling to cancel. We're not going to bill you during this period. We don't know how to do it yet. So it was very clear and honest about the whole situation. Like, we haven't figured out how we're going to do it, but we aren't going to bill you. You may see the bill show up, but you will get credited for that period of time. So don't cancel. And I thought, that's really smart. Obviously,
Yeah.
people are going to think, what recurring transactions can I cut? Well, I'm not going to the gym. I'm going to call and cancel my gym membership. And with that one email where they were not ready to send the email because they hadn't figured out the technology on their back end, but they still sent it just to be reassuring and honest, that is going to save them a whole bunch of cancellations in the long run. And losing a few months worth of revenue versus losing years of potential customer long-term value is obviously worth it in the long run.
And this builds into everything, right? Is everybody can do this by how they show up with their web presence right now. What is that being able to show their real life human side in this current set of circumstances? If you have customers that need base levels of service, but not now, there's no level of urgency to it. You could provide a tool for them to be able to leave details with some expectation of the fact that you've got it and when you'd get back to them. It doesn't need to be, we're going to be using these super advanced artificial intelligence, chatbot, VR type technologies to be able to actually provide service to customers right now. It could just be as simple as a basic web form
Yeah.
or communicating.
Yeah,
Um,
or even putting some sort of a banner across the top of your website or something that makes it clear whatever the status of your business is. Or if you're getting a ton of calls from people who are asking the same things about, if they can get a refund or what are
yeah,
you doing about this particular policy or whatever, make it really easy and obvious for people. And I think that kind of understanding the real human need of the moment and anticipating it and making it as easy as possible is what happens when a brand creates relevance in the relationship that they have with their customer, with the people that use their service. And relevance is a form of meaning. So
right.
that really gets back to that whole element of what we need as humans, as part of humanity, is to understand the meaning and the context and what matters in our relationships. And we have a relationship with the brands that we do business with. And when
Yep.
brands recognize that relationship and treat it respectfully and show that they understand what's relevant about the relationship, then they do us the service of being able to amplify that. And it creates that trust and it creates loyalty, that we understand why that brand matters to us. And it's going to be incredibly important to us to preserve that relationship going forward.
So in challenging times, humanity is maybe tested at levels that are slightly higher than in more comfortable times. And in these moments when humanity is tested, people's disagreements or judgments towards people who think differently towards them, or just general biases towards alternative points of view, can start to show up differently. People can find themselves in conflict a lot easier than they can do at other times. What do you think about all of that? And what could you apply to that as a lens that maybe helps anybody that is either finding themselves on the receiving end of that bias or conflict, or leaning into it in a way that they don't see truly true to themselves?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we probably all need to be cautious about is that we already knew that there were the concept of filter bubbles in social media, and that we were algorithmically sort of predestined to see ideas that agree with our own, and on one hand, so we'll tend to see the things that we like and we agree with, or the things that will cause us outrage, because outrage is a very engaging emotion and it will keep you coming back. And so the algorithms on Facebook and Twitter and other social platforms are engineered to be able to generate as much of that sort of simpatico, the likes and that
Yeah,
sort of sense, as much as the outrage. And it's like this game of like, what's the ratio have to be? So
because
I
it
think we
triggers
all,
response, right? Yeah.
yeah, it triggers response and engagement and recurring engagement. People will come back for that adrenaline hit, that jolt that they get from that interaction. So I think we have the duty to ourselves to remind ourselves that we are participating in an engineered experiment when we take part in
I love
those
that thought.
social
Yeah,
platforms.
we are participating in an engineered experiment. That's a
Yeah. I mean, we
yeah.
get a lot out of it for sure, right? Like it's nice to see your updates when I go on Facebook, and it's nice to see my other friends' updates. We get value out of it, but I think we also have to remind ourselves that it's not an entirely natural environment.
We
We're
are lab
we're
rats, right? That's what you're saying. We are lab rats. Got it.
so that's one thing. I think if we can keep reminding ourselves that we're not necessarily seeing the reality that we would probably create for ourselves, that's an important thing. So we can cut a little slack to the people that we're being presented with, because we're being presented with them for a reason. And then obviously I think there's a sort of there's a grace that we should probably find within ourselves for other people right now. Like, we're not at our best. I would imagine that most people can relate to the idea that during this pandemic, we are not at our best.
Right.
I am wearing makeup and my hair is done, but I am wearing flip-flops underneath. So
I'm in shorts and I wore flip-flops earlier, but now I am flip-flop lot less, just barefoot, which is a
barefoot. Well,
delight.
that it's even better. I mean, I just think, to the point, like, none of us are the fully polished professional versions of ourselves, or the fully put together versions that we would be under other circumstances. And if we go through the world in our own isolated space with that understanding and that grace for other people, I think it will help reduce some of those tensions. But I also think that there's a third component, which is, there's the whole recognize the filter bubble, cut people some slack and give people some grace. But a third component to this is, we do have to strive for better. And
Yeah.
that striving does have to push us toward an optimistic view of what can happen. And some of that is going to involve some confrontation. It is going to mean that we're going to have to challenge each other, and hopefully with grace, and hopefully with understanding, and an understanding of what we have in common. But we still need to push for what's going to be the better of these outcomes, even in the space of algorithmic optimization, or even in the space of what kind of technology is used to do things like contact tracing and all these kind of public health demands that are using our data in ways that we didn't know we were sharing them for. So there's big questions like that that have to be addressed, and then smaller questions that happen on a person-to-person level. And all of those kinds of things still have to happen. We still have to be true to ourselves enough to confront and face the futures that we have with integrity. But I think we also have to remember those first 2 points too. That we're
Yeah.
not making our own decisions all the time. We're being, kind of confronted with these filter bubbles, and we should probably cut each other a little slack right now.
And I'm just stumbling across a thought here right now as I listen to you about the first question I asked you, which is what is humanity, and how do we look at what it truly means to be human? And I'm wondering if part of this is this ability to ponder, this ability to filter, this ability to be able to apply a contextual lens to things that allows us to be a lot more subjective to multiple factors before
Yeah.
deciding something is right or wrong. It's this ability to be able to accept bias, to insert bias, or to respond to bias in some ways, where I guess sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. But this whole process of creating a thought before a thought.
So to the best of my knowledge, and no one has ever corrected me on this, we are the only self-aware species that we know of, right? So the out of all of the animals on the planet, and every animal we know of, no other animal is aware of its own thoughts and aware of its own existence in quite the same way that we are. And that's a really narcissistic perhaps, but also a really interesting way to live, right?
Right.
You're constantly asking yourself, where do you fit in the scheme of things, and how do
How
you
does this
relate?
relate to me? How do I relate to it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I do think that pondering is a tremendous part of the human experience, and it's a necessary part of understanding how to design for the human experience, in fact, to be aware of how central each person is in their own existence, right? Like it all relates to me. It all relates to my understanding of the world. And you know that as an expert on exactly what to say, right? Like so much of what you do in your work is about orienting the other person in the thinking that you're presenting to
Right.
them, right?
And you got me thinking here right now. And every time I speak to you, what I love is firstly your realism with a side dose of optimism, right? Every single time is very, very real, but the garnish is always optimistic. The garnish is always delight. And for those of you that are watching this on video rather than just listening to the podcast, is Kate wears that smile all the time, right? That is like a uniform for Kate O'Neill. Is even, I'm sure, if bad stuff is going on in your life, is still the smile shows up through not only the beautiful expression on your face, but the way in which you carry yourself throughout. Knowing there's lots of people right now that could maybe do with a slice of optimism, could do with um, some thoughts about the future that are better than the now, or better than their pessimistic viewpoints. What is Kate O'Neill's rally cry for humanity based on this moment of time?
Well, I think one thing is, to your very lovely point about the smile and the optimism, I always think back to a George Bernard Shaw quote, which is that life does not cease to be funny when people die any more than it is serious when people live, right? It's everything all at once. And I think that's the beauty of really soaking in what humanity is that we are supposed to live the fullness of experience. We're supposed to have the goods and the bads and the highs and the lows, the ups and the downs. And there's another quote that I love, which is a Neil Gaiman quote, which is that the difference between comedy and tragedy is where you stop telling the story. So everything is supposed to be about the challenges that we face and how we overcome them, the challenges that we face and how we overcome them. And so, yeah, sure, that means that when we're riding high, another challenge is coming. But it also means that when we're riding low, we're going to get through this. I hope we're going to get through this. Not everyone is, and that's tragic. And I really do feel for every single person and every single family who's affected in very, very real, serious, grievous, grave ways right now by this pandemic. But I also think that for the vast majority of us, we have a future ahead of this, and
Yeah,
we need to be looking to that future. And it's not a bad future. It's just a future. So nothing is either good nor bad
it
about it.
just is.
It just is. So I think it's how we choose to look at that and how we choose to move ourselves into it. Not at all invalidating the fact that you may feel bad at moments and through days of this pandemic. You absolutely may, and that's part of the human experience too. But humanity has a future, individuals have futures, and we are going to come through this broadly as humanity. We're going to have a future. And that future, I think, is something worth striving for to make it as good as it possibly can be. It's going to require us to be the best version of ourselves we can be right now and to be as present as we can, while also cutting ourselves some slack and cutting the people around
Yeah.
us some slack.
And there's another tiny point in something you just said is to make it, right? Is to
Yes.
make it.
Yes.
That to me screams of the fact that we all have a part to play in it. This isn't
Yes.
like what will happen, like it's all somebody else's fault. There is that whatever happens onwards from here is that we all have a part to play, and some will play bigger parts and some will play smaller parts. Some will be adding positive contributions and some will be sabotaging. But regardless of what happens, abstaining is not really an option. We're all contributing in some way. Am I reading that right?
Yes. So one of the things that I truly believe is that we are making the future every single day. Like every decision, every action that you take, that I take, that every person listening to this takes is making a future,
Right.
the collective future for humanity. And it's that sort of, butterfly flaps its wings sort of consideration, but everything truly is connected at some level. And the more we connect ourselves with that thinking, the more we put ourselves into the frame of mind that what we do for ourselves and for each other is going to have some direct or indirect effect on other people. And that the more we can contribute some good, something that
Yeah.
puts in place something good, the more we're making a better future for humanity. We do that. Every decision we make, every action we take contributes to the future.
I love the way you think. I really
Oh,
like the way
thank
you
you.
think. And I have a question about it, which is how much of your human experience that you can remember has shaped that thinking? How much of what you've lived through has resulted in you thinking this way? And how much of it is just this is how you've always thought?
It's a really good and fair question. I can't remember a time in my life when uh, I didn't think big ponderous thoughts. So I know that I've always thought about systems. I remember hearing a radio for the first, like not for the first time, but hearing a radio when I was a child and having immediately the thought of this must be coming through some sort of I don't know, transmission. I didn't have the word for it, and I was trying to picture like what's the building, where's the space where they're actually creating the thing, the sound that's coming through, and how is that happening? So my mind has always thought in systems. But I've also thought about meaning and about language, the way we communicate. So as I mentioned earlier, I was a linguist by education. I did a German major in undergrad with a Russian and linguistics double minor and a concentration in international studies. So it's the perfect background, as you might
Right?
expect, for a data and technology expert later in life. but but I think it is actually, it grounds me in this sense of what are the different tools we use to communicate with one another, and how do we do that? What are the methods by which we do that, and how do they differ from culture to culture? How do they differ from, kind of cluster to cluster, and how do those different tools change the way we understand intentions and outcomes and things like that? So all of that is part of my thinking. And of course, I, like many people, have been through personal tragedies and some ups and downs in my life, reinventions, moves
Yeah.
across states, so many different kinds of those types of things. And I think that's why that Neil Gaiman quote about the difference between comedy and tragedy is where you stop telling the story resonates so clearly with me, is because I am perfectly able to reflect on what's been tragic and hard about my life, losses and deaths of people that I love. But I also have been able to see those times, even close upon those times when I was able to laugh with my friends, even through tears, and have joy even in those moments, and have meaningful connections with people even at those moments. So there's never absolute, it's never all bad, it's never all good. And I think the understanding of systems and complexity has really allowed me to see the fullness of that picture, which is part of what the human experience really is that full, complicated, difficult, but beautiful, messy picture.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. Kate, I got two more questions for you. They're going to be a little simpler for you. The first of
Okay.
the two questions is a question I've been asking everybody recently. And I'm particularly interested in this from you because of your linguistics background. Like, I've actually got a fascination about your answering this question. That is, what is your favorite word and why?
My favorite word I learned in college was serendipity.
Ooh,
And I don't know that I learned the word in college, but I learned in college that it came from the Three Princes of Serendip, which is apparently, I believe it's a Hungarian fairy tale. And the fact that a fairy tale, like this made up word, turns into a word that so beautifully explains the notion of just like random chance things happening that happen to work out well, right? Like you, like the beauty of that word
yeah.
is so
It
great.
like is what it says, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Categorically, like you feel what it means within the way that it sounds and the way that it is expressed.
And the fact that that our language lacked a word to express that before, but now has exactly the right word to get it across.
Love it. Love it. So, final question from the interview with you today is, what is a word that you found yourself using a significant numbers of times recently that previously didn't exist in your vocabulary? Something you find yourself saying regularly right now that is like a new thing.
I don't know that didn't exist in my vocabulary. I'd have to think harder for one that didn't exist, but one that I think we've all been saying a lot is unprecedented. Like, this is an
Yes.
unprecedented time,
Yeah. Yeah,
which
I've said that
is,
a way too often recently, perhaps an
yeah,
unprecedented number of times, right? Is where we're at with that, to a point that now every time I say it, like a little bit of vomit comes up in my own mouth just
right,
for
right.
reusing the word again so often.
It feels so trite at this point, but that's only because there's so much truth to it that so many people have gravitated to it, and we've said it over and over because it is so true. But I think that's a really interesting. The fact that that word resonates so much for me and for you, I think, is a really interesting reflection on the fact that this is at the scale that it
Right.
is, and that we are living through this, and that we are going to come out the other side of this having recognized this massive shift that this represents.
And I think it's actually an example of the reason that it feels in some way unusual to be able to use it is because it's been overused. And perhaps in some of those circumstances being used out of context.
Right.
And it's the out of contextness that means that this word now loses meaning elsewhere. It makes me think of words like tragedy and crisis and any of these very extreme words that get used
Right.
in non-extreme sets of circumstances sometimes. That then means that when they are used in their right context, it's almost boy that cried wolf stuff, right? It's like that
Yeah.
word can't necessarily show up.
Exactly. I saw an interview with Fran Lebowitz that was published in the New Yorker the other day. If that will date this, if anybody wants to go look for it, but it's a brilliant interview. And one of the things that she says is how odd it is at her age, which she says is 69, to truly experience something she's never experienced before. And I really related. I mean, I'm only 46, so I don't have the 69 years of reflection. But at 46, I do feel like I've kind of seen a lot. And
Yeah,
it's, at 69, I can only imagine, like, you must feel like you've seen it all at this point. And yet here she's going like, I hadn't seen this.
that's
So
cool though.
truly, like you said, that's where I think we've been tempted to use that word in a cliche overexposed sort of way, when really we find, oh, this is what that really meant all along.
Kate O'Neill, where can people find out more about you? Where can they learn about your brilliance? Where can they plug in to be able to understand more about how you might be able to help?
My website is koinsights.com. That's my business. And you can find me on Twitter, where I'm very prolific, at Kateo, Kateo. My books are on Amazon and elsewhere, and I'm always available online in various ways. So please look for me and find me, and
Yeah.
I'll look forward to talking.
And certainly very active on Twitter. And you're not afraid to get into a big, meaningful conversation over Twitter too, right?
That's right. And I think, just one last thought on that is, I feel like there's some of the simplest tools in our digital space are some of the most useful right now. Like, I've actually found Twitter lists to be one of the most useful filtering mechanisms for getting us past that whole filter bubble rage, kind of liking stuff. If you can create a list of people who are creating meaningful content for you and really just spend time with that list, I feel like you're going to get a lot of value out of Twitter right now. So that's my one last takeaway for your
Yeah, I
audience.
love that tip. And I guess you can probably even take that tip and push it further of filtering your own friends list that you want to be
Yeah,
able to then hear from just by unfollowing people on Facebook or
right,
using the emails that you allow to be able to enter into your
right.
world. That whole filtering on purpose.
Yeah, I think intentionality is a really important piece of meaning. And so creating your own filter and making sure you choose what's relevant and what gets in, you're deciding what's significant. Meaning is about what matters. And if you decide what is meaningful, you also decide what matters and what you let into your space.
Such a big point.
And
Kate, thank
hey,
you.
thank you for letting me into your space.
Oh, well, I was just about to say something very, very similar, and that it's been a huge, huge privilege, not to let you into my space, but to be able to share you with some of the world that didn't know about your existence up until right now, or maybe add some further dynamics that people weren't aware of that were already aware of you, maybe hadn't got some of the insights that we got from you today. And being as your business name is KO Insights, I certainly thought that was remarkably insightful. So thank you, Kate. I appreciate you once again. Looking forward to coming to hang with you again next time I am home in the New York area. And yeah, can't wait to come and hang with you and that delightful husband of yours, Robbie, too.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bill.